from an equity standpoint, if you had bought a house 1989, regardless whether or not you've refinanced or not, in terms of the growth of your property, it is 336%. That is an incredible number.
So I wanted to kick off the new year with some useful and encouraging information. I firmly believe that you cannot time the market or predict exactly what's going to happen, as there are so many influencing factors to consider, or perhaps ones that pop up out of the blue that you didn't even know was a factor. However, there is history, and oddly enough, it does tend to repeat itself. If it didn't, I don't think there would be any actuaries or other financial and economists out there. So, if you quantify the data from history or the trends and statistics, you can get a pretty good idea of what may happen if a given set of circumstances or conditions are met for a particular situation. Okay, that's a mouthful. But basically, in today's episode, I've invited Robert Malcolm of Perch, Mortgage Brokerage, to walk us through some of the history, trends, and discuss the forecast for the 2024 GTA real estate market. Robert Malcolm is a Senior Manager, Sales and Partnerships at Perch. Perch is a mortgage brokerage whose business model is built on a customer-focused approach. Perch prides itself in providing excellent customer service while helping their clients achieve homeownership. Rob has worked in the finance and banking industry for many years. His experience includes working with brokers and underwriters with Equitable Bank, and most recently, he worked at Haventree Bank, helping mortgage brokers, credit specialists secure financing for more challenging cases. So, Rob, welcome to the Real Estate with Nicole podcast. I'm really happy to have you here today.
Oh, no problem, Nicole. It's great to be invited. Thank you so much for having me.
Awesome. Let's get started. So with today, I really do want to focus on maybe three main points. So as I mentioned, providing some context, so history and understanding trends, looking at the next 12 months, and key factors that are influencing our market today. With that, Rob, can you maybe give us a little bit of a historical concept with regards to the market? I can start us off with giving you, the trends over the past 40 to 50 years in real estate in the GTA. We understand and we know that over this time period, equity growth in real estate, no matter what type of property it is, has been about 6.6 to 7% year over year over this period of time. So with that, I was wondering if you could give us a little bit of history background with regards to interest rates and how that marries with the current real estate market.
Sure. Well, first things first, for everybody that's labeled, unfortunately, as a boomer or somebody who's older, they remember the reckoning of the late 80s, early 90s, where interest rates were double digits, and it was quite something to behold, and everybody was like, housing's going to fall. It's going to bottom out. We're all going to be a nation of renters. If anybody wishes to Google or Bing, that topic, you will get a plethora of articles showing that the sky basically was falling. And if we kind of run a compare and contrast as to what we have now versus back then, you will see some surprising similarities, despite the fact that houses are no longer 150,000, as much as we all wish they were. I will throw a stat out at you, Nicole. I was reading today in the National Post, I believe, from an equity standpoint, if you had bought a house 1989, regardless whether or not you've refinanced or not, in terms of the growth of your property, it is 336%. That is an incredible number. And the most important thing when talking about history is being able to take a step back. And when you're taking that step back, you're now able to see those trend lines that you're referring to today and why, to your point, you don't time the market. There's a wonderful meme that's made its way around social media, and it kind of shows a graph of like the insiders who seem to know in advance. And by the time it reaches the public, the trend is already changing. And so the public thinks they're in on this great opportunity, but the reality is it's the end of like that explosive growth period, and kind of what we call retail or, retail investors tend to kind of like prop something up that somebody else already bought in at. It's no different, I would say, than getting in on the ground floor of like a tech company like Google or Tesla before it was publicly traded. If you had foresight and you had connections, then you were able to buy in on that initial public offering from the get-go. So, of course, we're coming out of a double-digit interest rate period in our late 80s, early 90s, and really the government started to shift early 90s and around there. What ended up happening is, this is where you talk about CMHC initially basically being formed. The government didn't want the country to be a country of renters, ironically enough. They wanted it to be a country of owners. And so this Crown Corporation effectively is formed to lessen the risk to banks who historically have always wanted 20% down payment on a house. And if you talk to anybody, for example, in 93, like my parents, or 95, 96, you're still getting a detached house in Pickering, Markham, for example, for under $300,000. And people back then thought that was way too much, even though you're probably paying somewhere in and around a 6 or 7% interest rate. And that's down from the 12 and 14% interest rates of the 80s. And so globalization, formation of NAFTA, the signing of NAFTA, the implementation of NAFTA, the globalization of the world, where we've really become wonderfully interconnected, or laughably, depending on who you ask, has also led to like this crazy boom in interest rates. Because for the last 30 years pre-COVID, we've been basically hanging out around 3.5, more or less. You had kind of some ebbs and some flows, but that's basically where you were hanging out. And obviously with the pandemic, with us not knowing what was going to happen, governments around the world rushed to inject liquidity and inject money into the market in order to make sure that people, one, could pay their bills. Two, they would continue to, pay their mortgages and make sure everything was all right. And that's the great thing about uncertainty. You never know what the ultimate cost is going to be, which is what we're finding out today. For those of us in my generation who largely have not experienced anything other than the boom of real estate, and most of people in my generation barely remember paying 5% for an interest rate, whereas my parents can talk to me about 14 and 15%. And now with unprecedented, 8, 9, 10, interest rate hikes from our Bank of Canada, then we are now sitting at a lending rate of 5%. And that's kind of why we are where we are today. A lot of it is post-pandemic spending. And with that, there is a piper that needs to be paid. And that's unfortunately what we're paying now. The only difference is, as opposed to the house being purchased for, $300,000, you're kind of purchasing it for $1.3 million, which makes a phenomenal difference.
Exactly. So thank you for that history. That's awesome. And I like that example. I actually did see a video where they were interviewing people from CBC. Yeah, CBC. And they're saying, well, we're just going to have to be resigned to the fact that, 15% is what we're going to have to pay. And we're never going to see anything, below 11%. So, so anyway, thank you for that. So now, as you provided us that history, which is awesome. So the factor now is affordability. It's being able to afford that property at the current interest rate, or the interest rates over the next little period of time. So tell me a little bit about what's happening on that end, what you've been seeing.
Well, we've seen, the pandemic was a rush for everybody to get a backyard. For some people, it was a backyard and a swimming pool. For some people, it was actually a backyard and 2 swimming pools. And they would go out to far outreaches places, 2-3 hours out of the city, and they got depending on when they bought, a semi-decent deal. But for the most part, most of the people who bought in 2022, 2021 largely paid because money was so cheap. So the, not so much a litmus test, but the scale, if you will, is always low rates, higher cost to acquisition or acquire. Higher rates, generally there's a lower acquisition cost. Except you have this very interesting cohort, whereas the owner has been in the property for several years, could be 10, could be 15, and they don't need to sell. And so because they don't need to sell, they just put it up on the market. And the thing that always blows my mind is putting your house up on the market, especially today, is almost like when your insurer checks if you have good health, or if you're getting car insurance and you've ever had a ticket. Every time you list your house, you're basically making a line item in the history of your house. And so now the more times you repost, or I guess that's a social media term, but more times you relist a property, you now are inviting way more questions than answers. And generally, especially now, the overarching thought is desperation. You have been trying to sell this for 8 months and you have relisted, terminated, and done this cycle for, once every 3 weeks, once every 4 weeks. And it's been 6 to 8 months and it's still not selling. And the question is always going to be why.
Exactly.
And so for me, Nicole, this is always what I say to working with the clients that we work with at Perch, when they're wondering why their house isn't selling. I said, well, two things. One, the person who's buying your house doesn't necessarily care about the debts that you have and all the wonderful things that you want to do. Mm-hmm. Because if I'm a house owner right now, chances are I'm trying to do like a couple of things. One, pay off my debt. So fresh start. Two, get enough down payment so that I can buy my next house,
right?
Whatever that house may be. And the third thing is somehow use the sale of this property to create now emergency funds so I can become a savvy investor. And most people, when they start out, they want all three things. As time continues to pass, those things start to drop off up ultimately if they need to sell.
Right.
And so with that, the example I love to give is your stereotypical freehold townhome in Ajax. Mm-hmm. So typically this has been around $750 as a sale price, maybe a little bit lower depending on who the realtor is, what the client situation is. But let's just, for fun, work with $700,000.
Yeah, that's good.
Let's just do $700,000. So here's why your house may not sell. $700,000 requires a minimum down payment of $45,000. And just for the math on that, it is always 5% of the first $500,000 and 10% of any amount above that $500,000. So 5% of $500,000 is $25,000, and we get the 20 because the remaining balance on the $700,000 purchase price is $200,000. Therefore, that gives us $20,000. There's my $45,000. Great. But because you're putting down less than 20%, you have to pay mortgage insurance. Mortgage insurance at the minimum level is approximately 4%. So that's going to be in and around $28,000. Mm-hmm. So now if we add our $655 plus $28,000, you're going to get $683. $683 as measured as an actual payment, at assuming 5.5%, which is effectively where those rates are today, is a payment of $4,700. So what you're saying when you want somebody to buy your house for $700,000 is I want you to basically make a $4,700 a month mortgage payment. And again, that's assuming the minimum payment gets them through. Obviously, the more you put down, the lower the payment is. So this is, again, not to scare anybody, but that's effectively what you're asking. You're asking somebody to put almost $5,000. So now if you take, let's say, they say the average Canadian income is like 75 now. I kind of don't believe that. I got to ask where they're getting that from. But let's assume it's like around 60,000-ish. So it's 120,000 between two people.
Right.
They don't necessarily have 5,000 to put down on a payment to make that consistently without sacrificing something else. What if there's an emergency? We haven't gotten into heat, water. We haven't gotten into property taxes if it's not included. Those things all take away from disposable income. And that is why we see such a shift and such a change to a buyer's market right now, because anybody who's looking to buy effectively saying, yes, I can make the payment, even though that may not necessarily be true. And so now when we start to look at the market today, this is the time that every housing doomsayer has been waiting for. I've got Oshawa down, 42% from the highs of the pandemic, which I'm technically calling like Feb 2021. So you're down about 40, up to 42% in some areas. Kitchener's taken a hit. London's taken a hit. Very affordable places, but there were higher prices in London. To sit down there and say, a 3-bedroom bungalow with an unfinished basement was going for 700, 800,000 in London, people would look at me and they'd say I was crazy, but that's what was happening. Now, those same places, in some cases, especially if they took variable, and that's a variable rate, these are now selling for $100,000, $150,000 less because that payment is so there's no managing it. You have a fixed income. So forget everybody that's saying things about, incomes aren't rising as fast. No, the house is just too expensive. That's just what it is. And even though you fit at the time, and yes, there is a stress test, there's the stress test to protect the bank, but then what I call a real test. And the real test is when you buy a house, fundamentally, 2 things will happen. 1, you're going to live at Home Depot.
Uh-huh.
It happens every single time. I've never not had a client that didn't live at Home Depot for like the first 4 weeks of them moving in. You know why? Some people replace toilet seats. Others want to switch out lights. Some will want to swap out, door handles, cabinet shelving. You'd be surprised. And this is just getting in today. And the second thing that is irrefutable, and it doesn't matter, is that it is an adjustment, even if you're coming from another house. And so you now need time to kind of figure out your budget. And it doesn't matter how much of planning you've done. There's stuff you never planned for that actually ends up happening. This doesn't matter if you have a property inspection or not, just life happens. So I always like to say life is a wave and so is moving.
All right. Wow, you gave us a lot to unpack there. Okay, so unpacking the pandemic and what was happening in the market at the time and economics 101.
Right.
Supply and demand. Why were those prices? Why were people paying for those prices? One, the pandemic, people wanted more space. They could work remote. They wanted to get their quote unquote dream location. So give us a little bit in terms of, kick it off. Canada has been voted one of the top 3, comes in 3 cities in Canada, hit the top 10 in terms of most places that people want to move. Toronto is number 9, Calgary is number 7, and Vancouver is number 5. So this is where everybody wants to move. And recent statistics, I think middle of October, we have had over 729,000 people coming into Canada. That's been a record, either permanent residence or immigration into Canada. So just speaking about the supply and demand and people wanting to come to Canada, and also just the immigration.
Well, look, anybody who says that immigration isn't like a part of why we've had this housing boom is I think they're being a little dishonest, disingenuous. Fact remains is we have a population issue. We have what we call the boomer age, aka the greatest generation ever. They are retiring, and there's not enough able-bodied people of my generation to now fill those slots. But these people largely are also looking to maintain their house. And then these people generally also have kids. And they have kids who may not have the income or the means for full down payment. So this is where we get the concept of the bank of mom and dad. But from an economics 101, supply and demand, that's exactly it. We don't have enough houses in Ontario specifically, or in Calgary, or in Vancouver for that matter, really countrywide, to now balance out the influx of persons that are looking to emigrate to Canada. And so the numbers, I believe, are something like around 1 million people over like the next 3 years. I've heard something like 1.5, depending on what press release you would like to read from our current government. But the point is, pardon me, the point is that we don't have enough. And when you're coming here, rent, which is typically kind of what I call the immigrant journey. You come here, you establish yourself, figure out what you're going to do. Whenever you figure that out, you save your money, you buy your house. That's the dream. That's the plan. And the challenge that we have now is that I come here and I'm establishing myself, but guess what? Even at $150,000 with $100,000 down payment, I can't afford a house. And what I could afford potentially, because most immigrants are coming here with little to no debt. It's like a shoebox. It is effectively a 1 or maybe 2 bedroom condo if you're lucky, depending on where you get in. And that ultimately is the challenge. And because we have these challenges and because we aren't able to build housing fast enough, this, of course, creates an upward demand in terms of cost. So the nice thing is, if you've bought $1 million and, maybe you've taken a bit of a hit, maybe the house is worth 9, maybe 850, I personally believe that odds are that will go back up. Maybe not to the million, but maybe 950, maybe 925, which puts you in a better position than you are today. With that being said, you have our renting friends. Average rent right now in Toronto just crossed $3,000 a couple of months ago for one bedroom. That's insane. That's absolutely insane. So you can't even gig economy your way to a decent rent in a decent area where you feel safe. Because I think that's what everybody wants. They want to be safe. They want to feel secure. They want to upward mobility, climb the ladder, but it seems like the rungs have been cut.
And even with this supply and demand, another factor to factor into this, it's not that the prices of homes were that high. People were listing them at, this kind of like at that trend level where they were like 7% year over year, but it was the competition. It was, there's not many properties for sale on the market. And especially in markets where it's a high demand area, they have amazing schools, recreation, they're close to all the amenities, close to public transportation, you had bidding wars. And I've been in them where I think there was like 26 in one, 50 in another. And this was some of the things that drove up the price of the property. So yes, that's what the market demanded, and people paid because they wanted to get the home. So yes, and then ultimately it impacts everyone because of the affordability factor. And yes, now we do see the prices coming down, some areas more than others. In some areas, at least the areas I trend in Peel, they're kind of stabilizing and coming out to that trend line that we typically see over the 6.6 to 7% range. So that's what we're seeing now. But again, just to comment on that, just to say that, yes, these prices are high. A lot of it has to do with supply and demand.
Absolutely. Or lack of it.
Or lack of the supply. But then I wanted to talk about, you mentioned how we are moving into potentially a buyer's market, or things are balancing out. So speak a little bit more on what this buyer's market potentially could be looking like.
Well, we basically have now homes that have dropped, which we've kind of highlighted already. And as we said, it has dropped in some areas more than others. Look, I think the hot spots of like Toronto, Markham, Mississauga, they've largely held their value. But even I have been pleasantly surprised to see the hit that Oakville has taken, because they are actually down. And whereas you used to say, it's Oakville, I'll just pay whatever because I want to live in Oakville, that is no longer happening. And what we're seeing is, from ourselves at Perch, is we're seeing a lot of clients that are in power of sale positions or on the verge of losing their house because too much house, maybe there's a job loss or salary reduction, and now they can't make those very large mortgage payments on that variable rate, which is a factor in terms of qualifications, because sometimes you would just put the client in a variable rate, not necessarily us, but the bank, to make sure they could qualify. Now, I also think the onus should have been on each and every single broker that put their client in a variable to say, hey, guess what? It's going up. Maybe we should lock it in. But the challenge is when rates were largely at 2, let's take March 2022, which is when the first rate hike happened. If I was sitting at 0.89 on a variable and to lock it in for 5 years, because it's my first year in the property, I would have to pay at 2. I'd be like, no, oh my gosh, that's $600 more. No, I'm not going to do it. You think there is not one solitary soul that wouldn't kick themselves back in time to say, no, silly guy, silly girl, take it. It's okay. You can manage a 6. You'll cut back on Uber Eats. It's fine. But now you have clients that are largely sitting somewhere on a variable, depending on the institution, 6.2 to 6.8, 7% in some cases, some higher than 7%. That's a very large payment. So that's kind of part of the challenge overall that we're seeing and experiencing. And then, like you said, the supply and demand issue is always at the forefront. So now, from a seller's market standpoint, you can now walk back in and demand things you couldn't demand in 2022 or 2021. Building inspection. Those are making a comeback. One unpopular clause is, I agree to buy your house at the price that you want me to pay for it, only if I can sell my house. That is a very popular one. In fact, we had a client that was client number 2 on a string of 8 people that all had the same condition. Basically, if they can't sell their house, and then there's no deal. And our client was not able to sell their house. So now that cascaded down to the other 5 people. And so being able to pick and choose, especially if you're okay living outside of the city, this is wonderfully your time. It is wonderfully your time. You can go to Peterborough, get a house that you would have paid $9 last year, even during the rate hikes. You can get that house for like $750 right now. And the beautiful thing is that you literally marry the purchase price. So whatever you pay is whatever you pay. But the interest rate conversation, that's once every 2, 3, 5 years. You can adjust accordingly. So if you are in a position to go ahead and afford a little bit more now, you are laughing at the upside when we, again, step back and look at the 30-year, 20-year trend line. Real estate has historically proven time and time again, even in downturns of 2008, or when we were all scared of the stress test in 2018, it's rebounded and then gone up even more.
Exactly. And it's a matter of really having a plan and looking at your options. So making sure that you as a client, you understand, okay, I can get this house at this price. It's $250,000 lower than what I could have 2 years ago. The interest rate might be a little bit higher, but the interest rate is only temporary. And I know, or maybe you can speak to this, but I'm certain that in the next little while, the interest rates will be going down. And when you refinance, you'll be in a much better position.
Absolutely. And I think that's kind of like an action that a lot of people, or a view that a lot of people are taking. So I'm going to differ a little bit on the path, Nicole. Sure. I'm going to say that if you're going to buy a house right now, and the best rate you can get right now is, let's say, 6.25, otherwise known as 6.25. Just make sure you can pay the 6.25. It is unlikely to get worse, and it is more likely to get better with a rate drop. But the whole purpose of buying the house is that you can afford to live in the house that you want to get. What we don't want to do is we don't want to overstretch ourselves and say, oh, I'll just work more overtime. Because it's really, really hard to do that, especially with the stress of a new house. We hear from clients all the time. It's like, oh, I had to pick up another job. And again, our friends in the print media and digital media have also been saying this, where you have people working 2 and 3 and 4 jobs just to make sure they can make their mortgage payment. Not credit card, not car payment, not a loan, not groceries, not heat, just the mortgage payment. So this is where having a experienced realtor, one that very much is aware of the environment and the neighborhood or the city that you're buying in, is so critical and crucial. And that's why I've always been a fan of working with realtors such as yourself that know a specific area. I understand that any realtor can sell anywhere. That I am not taking that away from any realtor, but I think there is a difference in, I live currently, for example, in Halton Hills. I would want to get a Halton Hills based realtor that has been in the area predominantly for the last 10 or 15 years, that has a track record of success to sell my property, rather than ask my very best friend who happens to be a realtor, but she specializes in Durham. Not that my Durham best friend can't sell it. It's just at that level of network, that intricate knowledge of that neighborhood, that's putting her at a disadvantage, which I would never want. And as a client, I would never want my client to go through that at all. So when we're looking at the deals that are available, and there are a bunch out there, I think it's really important that you arm yourself with a realtor, position yourself with a realtor that is very in-depth on knowledge of the particular area that they claim that they specialize in. Very important, because that will help you get the best deal. It's not just doing a CMA, aka a competitive market analysis, throwing in front of the client and say, oh, well, we could get it for this. What's it based on?
Yeah, exactly. It's knowing little nuances that you couldn't pick up if you're not working in the area. It's like,
Exactly. There's je ne sais quoi.
yeah, exactly. Like you show so many properties. Oh, and even before I go to a property, because I know the area, oh, it's going to look like this. And you go in there and it looks like this. And then you look for specific things when you go into those properties.
Yeah, I mean, Google's great. Don't get me wrong. And I think, other kind of data-based, property apps, let's just call a spade a spade. Everybody and their mother right now is using House Sigma as almost like the de facto belief as this is what a property is worth, but that's not true. That's data points based on whatever their algorithm happens to be. Perch has one as well, but I will tell you from being in the industry for 20 years plus that nothing beats an appraiser. You can't do anything without one. An appraiser is so critical and crucial, and they will look at it specifically from hey, the property's worth this much based on current sales in the neighborhood, the type of the house. They're pulling up a bunch of stuff that typically realtors don't. And so when I see, any type of third party, data aggregator showing me that my house is worth $1 million, and then I get it appraised, first of all, and then it comes in at like 925, and I'm wondering, well, no, House Sigma. And this is not to knock House Sigma at all. I'm just picking on them because they're the most popular one. House Sigma said it was $1 million. Well, it said it was $1 million based on what they believe and the data points that they're choosing. But that doesn't necessarily mean that is what an accredited AACI appraiser is going to see. And that's where the difference
Exactly.
lies.
Thanks for pointing that out. That is so important. And I
Absolutely.
think that nuance is missed, especially during the period during the pandemic when all the activity and the bidding was happening. That was not necessarily something that was nuanced in anything. So
no, get the house. Cool, get the house. No, we'll pay whatever. Get the house. Do you have a pre-approval? No, get the house. Yeah. And that's where unfortunately some people fell. I fell in love with the house. For example, I didn't know that there was a train track running behind it directly because the wall is high. After I bought the house, overpaid by the way, then I'm hearing trains that are keeping me up at night. And I'm like, wait, why wasn't this mentioned? It wasn't in the remarks? That's what would happen. This wouldn't have happened, I should say, if you had a local realtor that knew the area.
Right. Interest rates.
Sure.
Give us a little bit, first couple of things. Give us a little bit fixed interest rates versus variable. I know you brought it up a little bit here, but I'd like for you to just give us a little bit of definition on that. And then what are your thoughts of the next 12 months in terms of interest rates, what Bank of Canada may be doing, what the economy may be doing, and how that might impact the market?
Okay, so first things first, fixed or variable. The way I see it is you take fixed if you're anti-risk or you like certainty. You like consistency. That fixed is for you. If you can afford a little bit of risk, you can potentially look at going to a variable. There are two different types. One is a fixed variable currently offered by TD, I believe in BMO as well, whereas the payment does not change if the interest rate goes up. So if Mr. Macklin comes out and says we're raising rates, your payment basically still stays the same. The challenge that runs into is that there's going to come a point, as we've recently seen this year, where your full payment is no longer covering the interest that you owe. And in that case, that can be requiring of you technically to either make a lump sum payment or adjust your payment accordingly. Or if you are one of those types, you can choose to leave it alone and then kick the bucket down the road till your term's up. And then you figure out what you need to pay to bring the loan back in line. Right now, we have seen fixed 2 and 3 year terms seem to be the most popular amongst our particular client as we do lend coast to coast. So people seem to be betting on the lower rate scenario in the future. And I guess from my vantage point, we saw the good, bad, and the ugly over the last 2 or 3 working days. So we started off with our friends down south, that's the US, them saying that, guess what? We're starting to have conversations about when should we be cutting rates? The market, being the investor market, bond market, stock market, everybody cheered. The TSX closed 500 points that day. I remember reading it in the Globe and Mail and I was like, geez, one guy has all that power just because of the language that he says. And so Mr. Macklin came out and said, yeah, you know what? We think we're going to basically hit the inflation target by the end of 2024, which would be different than the initial comments about 6-8 months ago, whereas we were looking at, higher for longer rates. We're maybe looking at 2025, maybe, ... And so now the rhetoric has changed. And then what ended up happening is that over the weekend, another kind of commentary from Mr. Macklem was like, well, hold your horses now. We may not adjust as quickly as you think we may adjust. And personal opinion is I think that he got caught proverbially with his pants down by saying rates are going to be low for a long time back in 2021, which is why a lot of people went out there and bought and moved out and took advantage of the ultra low interest rates only to get the carpet swept up under them, 6 months later, 4 months later, depending on when they bought. So I think he's really more just trying to cover himself so that he isn't kind of led to the political stockade, if you will. As far as my personal take on interest rates, well, shameless plug, Perch does an amazing monthly outlook where we kind of use the publicly available data and our data scientists to determine where we think rates are going, and it's been highly accurate. So I do encourage everybody to just give it a quick glance, and I'm sure we can do a plug of the website at the end. But for me personally, I will say this. Economists are wonderful. There are a lot of them that are tremendous individuals, whip smart, definitely would want to have the ability to bend their ear if I was making certain investments. I've heard as aggressive as January that the first rate hike or cut, will come. March has a couple of believers in it. But most people seem to believe June-ish is kind of where the first rate cut comes. Here's what I say to all of this. Even if the rate is cut January, March, June, how much do you think it's really going to be? If we're at a key interest rate of 5% and we cut it 25 points, that puts us down to 475, which means that this puts fixed rates firmly in the fives, alternative rates high sixes, and it doesn't necessarily affect private rates for those that are involved with private lending. What you need is a monumental drop of 2% for it to have any massively meaningful impact both on home prices and the economy. But the challenge that the Bank of Canada and the Fed face is that if you cut rates too quickly, then inflation comes roaring back and you've used all the tools in your tool belt, because all they can do is say the rates are higher, the rates are lower. That's basically it. And so if I'm already at a, let's say, higher rate than I'm used to, 4%, let's say, for example, from the BOC, and inflation comes back, the BOC has no choice but to raise it now 6%, 7%, 8%, whatever it takes to get inflation back under control, because I feel safe speaking for your audience, but I'm pretty sure everybody's tired of buying $10 eggs. We loved it when eggs were $3, $4. That was fine for a dozen. It was omega-3. You could pick white or brown, whatever your preference was, and you still knew you weren't spending over $5. Now you go to just about any grocery store, convenience store for eggs, and you're looking at 8, 9, 10. I recently saw one at a grocery store, $12. They claimed it was a typo, but I mean, how many people bought before somebody caught it? I don't know. And so with that being said, I think that 2024, personally, real estate may be flat or go up slightly based off of that, because there's approximately maybe 8 meetings a year for the Bank of Canada, and not every meeting's a guaranteed rise or cut. It may be where we are now, flat, unchanged, which is what we've done for the last 3 meetings since July of this year. And so you're now looking, you need at least 1% to make a difference. So we need that 5, which is where we're at right now, to drop down to a 4 for any meaningful change in the real estate ecosystem. One, people are justified in selling their houses for a little bit higher, or at least justified in what they're asking, because current homeowners are not trying to give it away if they can avoid it. Otherwise than that, you're kind of sitting here just trying to make it through another year as a homeowner. I just, unless there's something catastrophic that occurs outside of what we already know in the world from a geopolitical standpoint, I just can't see anything more than maybe 75 points by the end of the year. So that would take us down from 5 points to 4.25 or 4.25, which drops rates, decently enough, but not to the point where, hey, I'm talking about 2s and 3s again. We're still very, very much in the low 5s in that juncture or in that scenario.
Right. And it gives us more that balanced kind of market and an opportunity for buyers if they can get in and it's affordable. affordable. I do agree with that people should only be getting something that they can afford.
Absolutely.
And get jumping into the market at that time. Because when the rates do, or if and when they do go lower, we're going to get back into that same scenario we were in during the pandemic when there was a bidding. So that's the
right.
thing to keep in mind, because these trends do continue. As I mentioned, history repeats itself. But it's important for, you to understand, what the climate is like, what it might look like for the coming year, the next 12 months.
Absolutely.
So, Rob, is there anything else you would like to say? The floor is yours.
Floor is mine. Okay, well, I guess the first thing is, if you are looking for unbiased advice and it's with an educational bent, I would say kind of walk over to our website, www.myperch.io. We have a great bunch of fantastic tools that are a little bit more unconventional than what we'll see on your average mortgage broker's page. We've got everything from calculators that will actually calculate whether it makes sense for you to stop renting and actually own, to actual penalty calculations with about 50 of the leading lenders of the country. And so this arms you with information whether or not it is something you should be jumping into. I'm very much against people buying houses that they can't afford, or stretching things out, or relying on things like overtime to make it work unless it's absolutely necessary. One other thing I would like to mention is that, as I personally believe that the low point of the real estate market for the most part was last year, November, we're seeing prices creep up in the more desirable areas, and they are kind of holding steady / slightly creeping up on those outskirts that have taken such a massive hit. And then, because there are also persons who unfortunately are experiencing challenges, they need to sell. So the opportunity is certainly there. Again, as long as it's within your budget, make sure you're pre-approved regardless of who you work with, whether it's a bank or another mortgage broker or us at Perch. You have to have that pre-approval. You need to have the confidence that you can afford it before you bid.
That's critical. Pre-approval.
Absolutely. And I think the last thing that I would like to say is, remember, even if you want to get into the market, it doesn't mean that you should. And just because you're in the market, it doesn't mean that you need to stay. People have this misconstrued notion that home ownership is a guarantee, or it should be a guarantee, or it's a right. What you should have is the right to a safe neighborhood or safe space or a roof over your head. Whether you own it or rent it is effectively up to you. So for those people that may be having some financial challenges and it's like, how do I see my way out? Understand that talking to a professional, preferably outside of the bank, can maybe give you some insight in terms of what your options are before you actually have to sell. Because maybe there is a scenario where you don't actually have to sell. And I think getting educated before making any major decision, you do it generally, hopefully, before you get married. You do it before you get car insurance, and you definitely do it when you're picking a lawyer. If you're the type to get a will or insurance, you talk to an expert. So your house, which effectively is your largest purchase in your life, you should be talking to as many people as possible and working with somebody that you feel comfortable with, so that you can give them the full story, and so they in turn are able to best support you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Rob.
Pleasure is mine. Thank you so much for having me.
Like what you hear? Follow us on your favorite podcast app and leave a rating and review. If you know someone who could benefit from this episode, please share it with them. Sharing is caring. One last thing, I'd like to thank my producers, Stories and Strategies, for their amazing work.